In Jeremiah 12:5, God challenges Jeremiah, "If you have run with men and they have tired you out, how will you compete with horses?" God offers you a similar challenge to live a life of biblical discipleship and to build a healthy marriage and a godly family. He never promises it will be easy, but it will always be worth it. Are you ready to run with horses? Hello, this is Norman, and welcome to Run with Horses. Hopefully you're having a great day. It's a little cold and windy here in Wisconsin, but we have another great topic for today out of the J. Oswald Sanders book, A Spiritual Clinic. Today, the focus is on depression. I don't know about you, but I have been a little discouraged and depressed at times, and I think looking at the world today, most people have been. So hopefully you'll find this useful and interesting. I really appreciated the way that he approached this topic today. Just as a reminder, you can go to our website, www.runwithhorses.net, and you can find all of our past shows on there. But today's topic is, can a spiritually mature Christian be depressed? Have you ever thought about that? I think sometimes we only consider depression or discouragement or anxiety or fear or worry, all these different things. We think it's only something that an immature believer would struggle with. You know, I'm a mature believer. Obviously, I'm not going to struggle with that. Well, that's definitely not true. And we have some really good examples today from Scripture of people who were very close with God, walked with Him daily, but still really struggled with this idea of sometimes things don't go the way that I would like them to, and the way we allow our emotions and feelings to get away from us, it can easily spiral into depression. So I think as we look at the world today, I don't know if it's because it's more common or if it's just because we talk about it more readily, I'm not sure, but definitely depression, worry, fear, anxiety, mental breakdowns, they are seemingly more common than ever before. And when Sanders wrote this book, I think it was published in 1958, he said the same thing in 1958. Boy, it seems like this depression and mental breakdowns are more common than ever before. Well, it probably is increasing. At least our ability to hear about it is increasing. That part is definitely true. One of the things that the internet has brought us is information and more information and more information. So we have lots and lots of information, but often we don't have a good way of sorting through that information, figuring out what's important, what's not. It can contribute to our depression and discouragement, but I don't know if it's more common or if it's just because we hear about it more often. Or maybe people are more willing to admit it, and they didn't used to want to do that. But I do know, whether it's more common or whether it's just talked about more freely, it's not a new thing. You know, even some of the giants of the biblical record were knocked down by depression occasionally. You just can't read through the Psalms without seeing that, boy, David struggled sometimes. I mean, he had some rough days where he was really not sure why things were happening the way they were. But God ultimately worked in him and brought him back around, and he understood more of what God was doing. So definitely very common in Scripture. We should also always be aware that we have a very real enemy. And this enemy is really working to drag us down, to make us less reliant upon God, to encourage us to take our eyes off of God and to think about ourselves and what we're doing and what we feel like we need and all those kind of things. So definitely there's a very real spiritual battle going on, and we need to be aware of that. If you are one who is or has struggled with, those twin monsters of despair and discouragement, depression, I hope today's show will give you some hope. At the very least, hopefully you'll come away with, I'm not alone. I'm not in this by myself. I'm not the only one this has ever happened to. You're not alone. And it's not necessarily a sign of spiritual immaturity, although it could be sometimes, but it's not necessarily a sign of spiritual immaturity. When really we want to look at today in the life of mature believers who are largely and consistently following God. When we face that, how do we think about it? What do we think about it? What do we do with it? So Sanders gives us some thoughts on both the cause of depression and some thoughts about how we could turn our mind to get away from that. And it's really in the case of an otherwise healthy believer. Particularly in his case, he's looking at 3 men in the Bible who seem to struggle with what we would call depression, incredibly discouraged. And you say, how would you know? Well, here's a couple of verses that give you a good idea of where they were at mentally, emotionally, spiritually at a given time in their life. So first one is Moses. Look at Numbers 11, verses 14 and 15. And this is, Moses has had some highlights in his life. He has definitely rejoiced as the children of Israel escaped Egypt, and he's had ups and downs as they've gone through the wilderness. And the children of Israel just were very stubborn. If you're in leadership and you think about how difficult it can be to lead, boy, Moses, he can relate to you, and you can relate to him. It seems like people just didn't want to follow. They didn't want to do what they were supposed to do, and when they would do it one day, it would seem like before they got out of hearing, they had already turned around and were doing something wrong. So consistently, they were running away from God, doing something that was causing themselves harm. So Moses took all this, and how did he process it? Well, he said, I'm not able to bear these burdens anymore, God. It's too heavy for me. This is too much. Have you ever felt like that in ministry and leadership, just in life? So, God, this is too much. Take some of this away. I can't deal with this anymore. Well, I think all of us, if you live long enough, if you do anything, you're going to feel like that sometime. Like, man, this is just too much, God. Take some of this away. And he goes on, and this is just brutal honesty from Moses as he talks to God. He said, just please kill me. Kill me here and now. If I have found favor in your sight, just kill me and don't let me see my own wretchedness. He just is in the depths of despair and discouragement. And that's depression. Say, God, just kill me. And I know, often there are people who reach that point in their life where they are just so depressed, so beat down that they take their own life. In this case, Moses is not planning to take his own life, but he is saying, God, I am ready to go. Just take me out of here. Okay, that's pretty depressed, right? Well, the next one, look at 1 Kings 19. Who do we have here? Well, it's Elijah. And, Elijah had just come off a major victory. And if you think, Moses had gone through and saw those miracles as the children of Israel came out of Egypt and had all these real victories in his life, Elijah is the same thing. He had just come from this major spiritual victory over the priest of Baal. And first thing you know, he's threatened by Jezebel, and what happens? It says he went a day's journey. Just get out into the wilderness. Just got to get away. And he sat down under a broom tree. And he prayed that he might die. Again, God, it's just too much. Take my life. I'm no better than my father. Just take my life. Kill me now. So Moses and Elijah both came to this same place. And it's interesting how both of them, from a human perspective, we look at their life and go, it seems to me like they should have been pretty encouraged. Moses had this incredible victory and had this whole children of Israel. They've freed from slavery to Egypt. And wow, look at these victories. And he was talking to God. And Elijah, wow, what an amazing victory. And seeing the fire come down from heaven. And wow, God had just confirmed his message and the faithfulness of God there. But what did he say? Just kill me now, God. So quickly they went from the mountaintop to the valley. And then one more, and this one's a little bit different. But if you look at Jonah, and Jonah 4:3, so this is at the end, Jonah had gone through some ups and downs already. Because Jonah, the story, he had left, got on a boat, getting out of here. He does not want to go do what God asked him to do, go to Nineveh and tell them they're going to be destroyed. Jonah did not want to take that message because he knew who God was and he knew who Nineveh was. So he knew God is a God of mercy. God is a God of grace. God is a God of second chances. And the Ninevites were evil. I mean, he understood this is an evil, wicked people, and God's going to destroy them. Hey, pull up a chair, I want to eat some popcorn while this happens. He was ready for that. God, to go and preach the message that God's going to destroy them and give them that warning, he didn't want to do that. Give them an opportunity for repentance, he didn't want to do that. But he did, and they repented. I mean, can you imagine any preacher today would love to see revival? The whole city responded to God's message. I mean, that's incredible. They responded to God's message. They turned around, they repented, and God, as God does, showed them mercy. Now, that definitely did not make Jonah happy. He was not encouraged by that. He was very depressed by that. So he ended up going out and sitting outside the city and waiting to hopefully see the city destroyed. Of course, it was not. And Jonah 4:3, you get there and he says, God, please take my life. Please, God, kill me. It's better for me to die than to live. Again, somebody who has gone through what should have been a mountaintop experience, and his valley compared to the other ones, like, well, his struggles should have been pretty low compared to what Elijah was going through. I mean, Elijah at least had death threats, and Moses had all these people that were following him and a lot of responsibility, but Jonah seemed to have an easy time here. He's sitting under a tree or a bush or a small plant, a gourd, until it dies. He could have moved. He wasn't stuck there. He was free. He didn't have any real responsibility. But he was depressed, and he prayed that God would take his life. So as you look at these three men, you just go, wow, three men who just were really mighty prophets in the Old Testament. But they were so beaten down by their life, or at least their view of their life, their understanding of their circumstances, that all three men prayed for death. Now, Sanders points out that it's probably significant that this example that God gives us of these three men who prayed for death here that were really depressed is that they were great prophets. It's probably significant because if God had just showed us some average Joe who's a little overwhelmed, we wouldn't maybe have thought much of it. But this is Moses. This is Elijah. I mean, this is Jonah. Even they, shortly after major victories, struggled. So in some way, this is probably helping us to see that, even people who are consistently walking with God, who are doing the right thing, have the potential to struggle. So it's not a big surprise that you might struggle too. God revealed the weaknesses of these prophets and helps us see that we have weaknesses too. So how much more, if a prophet can be beaten down by depression, discouragement, despair, how much more can a nobody like me be subject to those feelings of just despair and insignificance? Their life was a reality of an example of the reality that there is this kind of emotional, spiritual pain, even in the midst of a successful ministry. I mean, if you look at Moses, you look at Elijah, by our accounts would say, well, they were pretty successful. I mean, Moses' job was really hard and people were stubborn, but he was doing a good job. He was walking with God. He was consistently showing the right heart and the right kind of leadership. But even in the midst of that, there was weakness, there was depression, there was fear. And God used them to show us that He gives grace for our weakness, and His grace is sufficient. So Moses had led the children of Israel out of Egypt and had seen God work just astounding miracles on their behalf. And yet, after the suffering through their complaints of the children of Israel and their just continued rebellion against Moses himself, but also against God, primarily against God, Moses was tired. He was tired physically. His job as this leader, particularly going across the wilderness, that's physically, he had a lot of work. He's the judge as people came to him, and he had to answer people's questions and help them understand God's will. And then they're traveling and they're walking, and he's physically tired. Mentally, he's the leader. He's the man. I mean, if there's a big decision in Israel at the time, you go to Moses, he's the man. Emotionally, spiritually, Moses was tired. He had tried to carry this burden of leadership alone, and he crumbled under the pressure. I mean, it was tough. So we need to understand that Moses was carrying a weight that he really wasn't meant to bear. He was not meant to carry all of this weight himself. Now, really, he primarily is supposed to rely on God, but God had hope for him, and we'll get to that in a minute. But similarly, Elijah was hot off one of his most dramatic victories against the prophets of Baal. He had just received fresh confirmation of God's hand on him and God's message, God's faithfulness to his word. And yet, he receives a death threat from Jezebel, and his courage fled. He had just trusted God to go up against all of these prophets at once. But he fled and ended up hiding under a juniper tree when Jezebel threatened his life. So from the highest of highs to the lowest of lows so quickly. Does that sound familiar to you? I mean, it's certainly, as I look at my life, there have been times when there were obvious signs in my life of spiritual victory, and there were things were going well, and then it seems so quick for me to turn and be distracted by something else. And yet in the middle of that, God's grace is sufficient. And Jonah, he was traumatized by his ocean voyage and its abrupt end. He finished well. He went to Nineveh. He did the job. He saw Nineveh repent and should have been, just celebrating who God is and God's mercy. But Jonah had other ideas. And his ideas and his hopes were thwarted by God's grace. So he ended up sitting alone and complaining and eventually succumbing to the temptation of self-pity and praying for death. So why did all three of these men turn so easily from God's obvious handiwork and work in their life and through their life? Why did they turn around so easily? Why were they distracted so easily? Why did they fall into depression so easily? Well, I think we have a couple of answers to that, and you can probably relate to some of these too. So first, and I think all of us need to always remember, we are in a very real spiritual battle, and there is a very real enemy. So all three of these men, and you too, if you are a follower of Christ, you're in a spiritual battle. They were in a spiritual battle. Satan was fighting against the children of Israel, the plan of God, from the very beginning. And he's doing that in your life too. He has set up the world to be against what God is doing. So recognize you're in a very real spiritual battle. If you're not aware of that, you can be blindsided. You can be not aware of some of the problems that are going to come. There's a very real spiritual battle. Second, all three of them, if you look at the context and the story and the things that were going on, it's pretty easy to see that probably all three of them were physically drained. Moses was drained from his role as a leader, from all the work of just traveling through the wilderness, from everyone coming and asking him to make these decisions and judging, and just mentally, emotionally. People bring their fights and their complaints and all that. It's a lot of work to carry that. So Moses was tired. Elijah had come off this big victory, but it was a lot of work too. Spiritually, it's draining to serve up front that way. A lot of people are looking to him. He has this emotional and spiritual energy that's spent, and then he's tired. And then the days walk into the wilderness, and he's mentally, emotionally, spiritually drained. Jonah, he had got on this boat, and he's in this spiritual battle. He's running from God. Oh, and then he has a forced 3-day fast, unless he's eating something in the belly of the fish, which I'm not sure I want to think about that too much. But then he had to make this walk to Nineveh, so his journey, and then Nineveh's a big city. He's walking around, he's proclaiming the message, and if you think preaching or public speaking is tiring, imagine going and having to use your big outdoor voice and go all around the city proclaiming God's destruction. So that's tiring, that's draining. And then he again is in this mental battle within himself that he doesn't want God to do what he knows God is capable of doing. So again, he's just tired physically, mentally, spiritually. Third, I think we can look at where they were at and what they were doing and say, it seemed like they were judging the success or failure of their life and ministry at the time based on their own sight and knowledge of how the spiritual battle was going, of how their life was going, and they felt defeated. You know, Moses was looking at the children of Israel and say, man, they are a stubborn people and they just never listen and they're constantly complaining and fighting, and it just didn't seem like it was going well. Elijah, you know, he had come off this great victory, and then now he's receiving death threats. This is not what he was expecting and hoping for. And Jonah, again, it's a spiritual battle. Is he doesn't want God to do what God's going to do. This is a terrible people. Why would God forgive them? So they were seeing their life maybe in a different way from the reality, from what God was seeing, from what God was doing. And because of that, then we have the fourth one. They took their eyes off God for just an instant, it seems. You know, Moses took his eyes off God and what God's doing and look at the people around him and look at the problems rather than the God who was able, who had proved himself coming out of Egypt and all the miracles and supplying food and all those things. Now he was seeing just the problems. But God was the God of solving problems. So he had to have taken his eyes off God for a second. Elijah, same thing. He has been through this great victory. God had proven himself and his commitment to Elijah and his message. So what happened? This one queen caused him to run in fear because, again, I believe he took his eyes off of God for a second. He saw the problem, this mean lady, instead of the big God. And Jonah, he knew God was capable of forgiveness. He knew God was capable of reconciliation. And instead of desiring to be drawn closer to God and to know him better, he looked at himself and what he wanted and put that in first place. So he took his eyes off God for a second. But then God did work in each man's life and met them where they were at and took them to where they needed to be. So in Moses' case, God gave him the help of 70 men who could share his burden of leadership and a father-in-law who could encourage him. Jethro was a great encouragement to Moses and helped him. Elijah received solitude for one and refreshment from God, along with some big news. 7,000 other people had not bowed to Baal. Elijah was not alone. He really felt for a while that he was alone. But he wasn't alone, and God let him know that, and that was encouraging at a time when he needed to know that. Jonah received a very important lesson on God's mercy in the form of a plant. And as Jonah mourned this plant and the loss, God helped him to see how God had pity on the Ninevites. So he received a lesson. And all three of them then were able to reformat their thinking and get it in line with God's, and maybe let go of some burdens that they weren't supposed to carry and let God carry those burdens. So what are our takeaways as we think about depression in these men's lives and in our life? Well, one is that depression can follow spiritual success or spiritual failure. You know, it's not related necessarily to how things are going in your life. It can be. Certainly a big failure, a big problem can lead directly to despair and discouragement and depression, but not necessarily. It can come equally after a big success. Our physical condition can open us up to spiritual attack. I think that's an important one. You know, I've always encouraged people, you need to exercise, you need to be in shape, you need to be physically taking care of yourself because, there are many reasons. One is your body is a temple of the living God, but this is another one. Our spiritual battle often takes place in a physical form, in the flesh, in the body that you have connects to this spiritual battle. If you are physically weak, if you are physically not taking care of yourself, you can open up the door to temptation and to lots of problems that you might not have if you were taking better care of yourself. So our physical condition is important. Taking our eyes off of God, even for an instant, can be devastating to our faith. It's so important that we develop this practice, this habit of really keeping our eyes on God. no matter what happens. The highlights, the lowlights, the good days, the bad days, we really want to keep our eyes on God. When we take our eyes off God, we open ourselves up to spiritual attack. And our lives are hard enough without that, without taking our eyes off God. It's hard enough to make it through. Another lesson is that we can take solace in the Jethros in our life. God gives us people who can encourage us, who can come alongside us and look at our problem from outside. I think that's one of the values of a Jethro in our life. Moses looked at his problem and he was so busy dealing with the problems that he couldn't see a simple way to make it easier. But Jethro was outside of this. He wasn't answering the questions. He just was watching Moses do it and said, hey, this is not good. Well, I need somebody in my life who'll come along and look at my life sometimes and my struggles and say, hey, this is not good. And they can point me to a better way. Also can be encouraged by the thousands of others who are in the fight with you. I think that's equally important to recognize we are not alone. You're not in this battle by yourself. God is doing something awesome. God is doing something great, and He is using you, and He is using other people like you. You're not alone. Too often we feel like we're in this battle by ourselves. We can't share our struggles. We have to do it all by ourselves. Well, that's not true. That's never true. You're not in this alone. And maybe the biggest lesson in all of this is that God cares. His grace is sufficient, and He is with you even in the depths of despair. You may not feel like you deserve His love, deserve His care. You may feel like you're a failure, but God is there. He understands. God promises us His presence in the middle of our difficulties, and He often gives us solutions if we are open to them. Moses could have rejected Jethro's advice, and that would not have gone well. Elijah could have rejected the solitude and refreshment that God offered him. Again, that probably would not have gone well. Jonah could not learn from the lessons that God offered him, and then his spiritual life would be less too. So we want to learn the lessons that God gives us. How are you doing in fighting the spiritual battle? It's definitely a hard one, but you're not in it alone. Pray for each other. Unite with your church. Encourage people in your church who are depressed, people who are struggling, people who are succeeding. Encourage them, pray for them. Let them know you're praying for them. Be part of an awesome body of believers who are rejoicing together and pursuing God. And whatever you do, keep running. Thanks for joining us today. If you have a question we can address on the show or just want to send us a word of encouragement, send an email to talk@runwithhorses.net. That's TALK@runwithhorses.net. We look forward to hearing from you. In the meantime, keep running.